This week, chapter 20, and it starts out this way. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain, and he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. Okay, there's a lot of words we need to understand here. He had a key to the bottomless pit, and that word bottomless pit is the Greek word abuso, which means the abyss or the pit. Remember when we talked about our study of hell, of Sheol, that there was a place of torments where the rich man was, and then there was paradise where Lazarus, the beggar, was with Abraham, and in between them was a great gulf. That's the abyss. And this angel had a great chain in his hand. That chain, that word is a word that means shackles or manacles. It's not the word for a long chain, but the word for those things which go on hands and legs and keep people in place. And he seized the dragon. That means he took hold of him. The word akrasin really means to use strength on something. And the word dragon is from ha-drakon, which comes from a word that really means good eyesight. So theoretically the dragon had good eyes, but he's also known as the serpent because the dragon was believed to have a serpentine type body. And he's also called the devil. That's the Greek diabolos. And that literally means the accuser. And you'll remember that several weeks ago we studied the fact that the Satan was in heaven where he is accusing the saints day and night. That's how he gets his name. He's the accuser. So literally, this verse reads, he grabbed the dragon, the old serpent, who is an accuser and an adversary, and bound him 1,000 years. How do you bind him 1,000 words? He bound him 1,000 years. Was he thrown into the lake of fire? Not at this point. No. Is he the first one to go into the abyss? No. There have been several angelic beings who've been bound in the abyss. 2 Peter says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept unto the judgment. And the word translated hell there is Tartarus, which is another name for the abyss. But we also know in the Gospels, when Jesus healed the Gadarene demoniac, he asked the demon what his name was, and he said, Legion, because we are many. And then this legion of angels begged him and said, and they begged him not to commit them to depart into the abyss. So the angels that sinned know that the abyss is a bad place, and they don't want to go there. And he bound him for how long? Is that a literal 1,000 years? Or does that just mean a kind of a long time? Yeah, it all depends on how we interpret the book of Revelation. And remember, we said from the beginning that we're going to interpret it literally and take a literal interpretation unless the context indicates that it's something different. Like it says, they saw a vision of something. Okay. In this case, there's no vision involved. It just says he bound him for 1,000 years. The word millennium means what? Means 1,000 years. So when we talk about the millennium, this period between the tribulation and the end of time, the great white throne judgment, that is the millennium, the 1,000 years. And what's happening on earth during those 1,000 years? Jesus is reigning on the earth during those 1,000 years. This is the promised reign of the Messiah that the Jews have been promised for thousands of years. Now, there are three concepts, three interpretations of the millennium and with the return of Christ. We believe, because of a literal interpretation, that Christ returns before the millennium. That's referred to as a premillennial position. There are those who believe that the word millennium doesn't really mean 1,000 years. It's just a long period of time. And they interpret that as just being a long time that he's going to be reigning. That's called the amillennial viewpoint. Now, that was first came about in about the 6th century, I believe. No, the 3rd century. And it was championed by a monk in the Catholic Church who was very well regarded by the name of Augustine. You've heard of St. Augustine? He was sainted by the Catholic Church, but he was one of the great scriptural scholars of the 3rd century. But he didn't believe in interpreting the Revelation as a literal interpretation. He believed that 1,000 years was the period between Christ's first coming and his second coming. Now, of course, it's been almost 2,000 years now since his first coming, and he hasn't come again. So after the first 1,000 years had gone and nothing happened, they began to adjust their viewpoint and say, well, it doesn't really mean 1,000 years, it means a long period of time. The third viewpoint is the belief that we are in the millennium right now, and that the world will gradually get better and better as more and more people are converted to Christ. And eventually the whole world will get saved, and then Christ will return.
That's totally not true. Do you think that the world's better right now?
This was a viewpoint in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, but has been pretty much abandoned by most of its adherents. Right. Okay, verse 3. And he threw him into the pit. And that was the abyss, remember? And shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So, Satan will be bound in the pit for 1,000 years while Christ reigns on the earth, and nobody on earth will be tempted by Satan. He will not be able to lead people astray while he's bound there. Will people still sin? Why? Because we have a sin nature. Absolutely. Very good. Well, teenage boys do have sin natures. So do teenage girls. So do adult boys and adult girls. In fact, so do baby boys and baby girls. Something we all share. Verse 4, Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. So there are thrones, he said. Who is sitting on those thrones? Do we know? Well, there are several clues. One of them comes from Matthew, when Jesus said to his 12 disciples, "Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." And there are many who believe that that's why, after Christ was raised, the apostles got together and selected a 12th apostle to replace Judas.
So Judas is, if the disciples are the 12, Judas is not a part of them?
No, Judas disqualified himself, basically. Okay. But also in Revelation 3 we read, "The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, and as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." And in Revelation 5 it said, "And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." And then in 1 Corinthians it says, "Or do you not know that the saints," meaning Christians, "will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases?" So all three of those verses point to the fact that Christians will be ruling on those thrones. And remember in chapter 3, chapter 4, the first vision we had of the throne room of God, God was sitting on the throne, and who was surrounded the throne? There were 4 creatures, and then around them were 24 elders. And those elders represented the church, absolutely. So not only will we be ruling on thrones during the millennium, but we will be on thrones ruling for eternity. Okay, verse 5. "The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection." What is the first resurrection? When what?
The rest of the dead came to life.
Would you consider Jesus' resurrection the first resurrection? Yeah? How about the saints that also came to life when he was raised from the dead? And how about the church when we were raptured? Is that a resurrection? Yeah. That's all happened before this.
I kind of agree with Mom. Like they're saying this is the first resurrection of the non-believers.
No, this is this reference. It says the rest of the dead. The expression just before that was, "I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had received its mark." That's what he's referring to as the first resurrection. So the martyrs from the tribulation period. The first resurrection does not refer to a single event. It refers to a quality of the resurrection. Okay? The quality being the first type resurrection. That which is like Jesus' resurrection. The resurrection of those who are saved. Because there will be a second resurrection, which is those who are resurrected and appear before the great white throne judgment. Those in the first resurrection will not be hurt by the second death. Okay? So there is a first resurrection and a second resurrection. There is a first death and a second death. Does the first death occur all at the same time? No. There are many people that die, every day. So the reference to the first resurrection is a reference to the quality of the resurrection, not a specific point in time event. Okay? And he said, "Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power." And what is the second death? First death is when people die physically. The second death is when they are cast into the lake of fire.
I've heard it kicked. It's dead from school.
It's what?
It's dead from school. I haven't been in school so long.
Yeah, okay. So what he says is those who have the first resurrection type of resurrection, those who are resurrected to life, over such the second death, being cast in the lake of fire, has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So, we will be part of the first resurrection as believers. For us, that will happen at the rapture. The second death will have no power over us. Let me read what John Walvoord says about this whole thing. It helps to make it a little clearer. It would seem clear from these facts that the term the first resurrection is not an event, but an order of resurrection, including all the righteous who are raised from the dead before the millennial kingdom begins. They are first in contrast to those who are raised last, after the millennium. Then the wicked dead are raised and judged. Just as these are two kinds of physical death, namely the first death that results in burial, and the second death, which is described as being cast into the lake of fire, so there are two kinds of resurrection. The first resurrection having to do with the resurrection of the righteous, and a second resurrection having to do with the wicked. They are separated by at least 1,000 years. Just as the first death did not occur to all in one moment, but is experienced individually by those who die over a long period of time, so the first resurrection is fulfilled according to the groups that are in view. So, it is, as I said, the first resurrection refers to the type of resurrection, the resurrection to life. Okay, so now we skip ahead a couple weeks, actually 1,000 years. Verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be released from the abyss, and he will be able to go about the whole earth, and he will begin deceiving people again. And he will deceive so many that they will gather together and form an army to fight against God. And he says, deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Now we've heard of Gog and Magog before, right? There is a battle before the rapture occurs called the Battle of Gog and Magog. And it's described in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Some people think that that's the same as this battle. And they try to make the millennium be during the current time frame because this battle hasn't occurred yet. The problem is the Battle of Gog and Magog occurs where? On the mountains of Israel. Right? What does this say? And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Do you remember we talked about at the end of the tribulation there is this massive earthquake, and all the mountains disappear and all the islands disappear, and the whole earth will once again become a level plain. And this description of the armies coming to Jerusalem, they marched up over the broad plain of the earth. Okay? So that's a different battle entirely. There's a couple of other differences. In Ezekiel 39, the army of Gog and Magog fall on the mountains of Israel, and their bodies are eaten by birds and beasts of the field, and they will be buried throughout the land wherever their bodies are found for 7 months. Also, their weapons will be burned for 7 years after the battle. In this current battle of Gog and Magog, how are they killed? And they marched over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and heated them up a little bit. Now it says consumed them. And that word translated consumed means to be absolutely, completely consumed. Gone. Not even a hair. Not even a piece of fingernail. So this is not the same as Ezekiel 38 and 39, Battle of Gog and Magog. This one is at the end of the millennium. Satan goes out and deceives the nations again, brings them to battle, and they march across the broad plain of the earth, and they surround Jerusalem, which is the only mountain left, and fire comes down out of heaven and consumes them.
How could Satan deceive even more if all the people left are followers of Christ?
All of the people who go into the millennium are saved, right?
But they have children.
But they have children.
In their father's footsteps.
And some will be saved during the millennium.
Yes.
And I believe that what they will have to believe to be saved is that Christ is reigning.
Okay.
Okay? What was it that saved the 8 people in Noah's day? What did they have to believe? That a flood was coming. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so at the end of the millennium, Satan goes out, deceives the nations, brings a big army across the broad plain of the earth and surrounds Jerusalem, and fire comes down out of heaven and consumes them. Boom, they're gone. And the devil, who had deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. Now that's an unfortunate translation, because he says they were, which would seem to imply that they're not any longer. There is actually no verb of being in that sentence. In other words, it doesn't say where the beast and the prophet are, or were, or had been, or would be. It just says where the beast and the false prophet. Okay? It's implied. Yeah, he was thrown in there where the beast and the false prophet. And they were tormented day and night forever and ever. Will that torment end eventually? Not according to this verse. There are some who believe that God would not be so cruel and he wouldn't torment people forever and ever. But if he doesn't, then he's a liar. And God is not a liar. They got what was coming. Yep. And even the unsaved today will get what's coming to them, because they refuse to believe and they refuse to submit. Okay, so Satan is now in the lake of fire with the beast and the false prophet. Then I saw a great white throne, and I saw him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. Now, in the original Greek, it says earth and heaven. Okay, these translators think that just referred to the first heaven. I think it refers to the whole universe, all of the physical world. If there was no place found for them, where were they? They didn't exist. If no place was found for them to be, it means they didn't exist. So heaven and earth will be utterly destroyed. Okay? Not talking about the lake of fire now. I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. So at the end of the millennium, when the great white throne is set up, the current heavens and earth will be destroyed. They will simply be no more. So, the great white throne does not occur until after the millennium, and heaven and earth are destroyed. Now, it's interesting, in 2 Peter, it says, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. That word dissolved is the Greek word that means to let loose. From the Greek word luo. The physical universe will be let loose. Well, what does that mean? Consider this. What is in the center of the atom, in the nucleus? What? Protons and neutrons. And what is the electrical equivalence of protons? Of neutrons. They're neutral. That's why they're called neutrons. Okay? So you have protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and electrons are on the outside. The electrons have a negative charge, but the protons all have a positive charge. Okay? What do we know about, in the world of magnetics, about like charges? They repel, and opposite charges attract, right? So if protons are bound tight together in the nucleus of an atom, why don't they just repel each other? Science has never been able to explain this. Okay? I believe that God is the one that holds them together there. Now, think of this. What happens when the nucleus of an atom is split? That's what's referred to as nuclear fission. And it produces massive energy and heat. Okay? So, if all of the atoms in all of the universe were suddenly let loose, it would be tremendous heat and everything would melt. Right? And waiting for and hastening the coming day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, let loose, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. That sounds to me like a description of all of the nucleuses of all atoms in all the universe are suddenly released. Verse 12. And I saw the dead, great and small. Now, where are we at this point? We're at the great white throne. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Books. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. Now, pay close attention. Who is standing before the great white throne? And I saw the dead. Right. If you're a born-again Christian, you have eternal life, right? You may die physically, but you are not dead because you have eternal life. Christians will not appear before the great white throne. Only the unsaved, only the dead will appear before the great white throne. And notice, there are books, and then there is the book of life. And what are they judged by? The things that are written in the books. Okay? So their works, in fact it says, the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. So it's their works that are being judged at the great white throne.
Because they're already not in the book of life.
They're already dead, yes. Okay? They're already going to the lake of fire. They're already going to suffer eternally. So why judge them according to their works.
Is there worse layers?
Apparently, there is worse torment for some than for others. Okay, so those who appear before the great white throne will be judged for their works. And then in verse 13 it says, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done." So again, it's a works-based judgment. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. "And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." Now this is a particular construction in Greek known as a first-class conditional. There are three different conditional clauses in Greek: first class, second class, and third class. And they're all in the if-then form. The if part is called the protasis. The then form is called the apodosis. Okay? In the first class Greek condition, the protasis is assumed true. Okay? In the second class Greek condition, the protasis is assumed false. And in the third class, there is no assumption made. It's a true conditional. So, this where it says, "If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." The structure of that is a first-class condition. So it's the assumption that it is true. So we could translate that. And since no one's name was found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. And we've already discussed the fact that only the dead were standing before the great white throne, right? This is just more support of that whole fact. And the second death is the final death. The lake of fire is the eternal dwelling place of those who don't believe. Gives us all the more reason to get out and witness to people, doesn't it? Questions?